Okay. I think I'm gonna start slowly. I'll talk slowly for a couple of minutes, and then hopefully by the time I finish, the rest of yes, because there are people still definitely coming in. So welcome everybody, and thank you for coming to Masterclass 3 of our Building a Subscription Business series. My name's Johnny Caldor. I'm going to be hosting this event, and I'll introduce you to Claire and Michael in just a second. Just a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, this video is actually being recorded so that we can have it for posterity. So you will be able to watch it and listen to it after the event. If you've got questions, there is a chat window, and we have quite a few of us monitoring that chat window. So we're going to hopefully get to everybody's questions, assuming we have the time. We're trying a slightly different approach for this class versus the first two. So with the first two, we did them as a webinar. This time it's a meeting. So you will see, particularly when we stop sharing the screen, you'll see lots of people. In fact, everybody on the call is visible either as an avatar or actually in video. We've disabled microphones just to avoid any embarrassing noises off. But if you do have a question, please pop it in the chat window. I think the nice way of doing it as a meeting rather than as a webinar is we actually get a sense that, you know, we're all kind of here together rather than us talking into a black hole. So hopefully this one works out. So yeah, I'm going to kick off with the content now. So Kim, can we go to the first slide? I just want to put this into context then before we actually dig into today's content. So the whole idea of this series, if you haven't seen the first two classes, I'd recommend going and watching them actually. But basically we got together PugPig, Manifesto Growth Architects, who were a consulting firm, and Piano, another platform and consulting company, because we've been talking to a lot of customers over the last months about just this: how do you build a subscription business? And it felt like between the three of us, we're having this conversation so often, we have very complementary skills. It felt like a really good idea to get together and actually put something together where we can cover the whole process, from creating a value proposition to designing and building a product to launching it and optimizing it. So that's kind of what you're watching and listening to right now. Today in particular, we're going to focus on step 4, which is product design. And over the course of the next few weeks, we will hopefully cover every one of these 9 steps. So it'll end up being a 10-step course, one which is an overarching view, and then each of these steps in between. But today, as I say, we're going to focus on product design. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Claire and Michael, and then we're going to kick off. And the majority of this call, of this class, is going to be discussion. So I'm going to start with Claire. Claire Evans is a senior product manager at the BBC, specifically in news, where she's worked across their international news sites, apps for learning English, and right now she's working on the digital election results. She also used to work at PugPig as our product manager. So I've known Claire for many years now. And then Michael Kowalski, who is head of product at Tortoise Media. He's worked in product and user experience for over 20 years, specifically designing apps and systems for media businesses like News Corp. Again, that was with us. So we've worked together as well in the past, and The Guardian, and also founding a couple of startups along the way, one of which did something very similar to what we do at PugPig. So thanks to you both for joining. It's really good to have you here. The way this is going to work is Claire is going to start, and she's going to spend about 10 minutes talking about the front end of the process. So we split the process pretty much in two, and she'll be covering product definition, user needs, how do you define the scope of this product, how do you build a feature list, how do you determine what you're actually going to deliver. And once she's got through that, we're going to open up to questions, and we'll have a bit of a discussion around her part of the process. And then straight after that, we'll switch to Michael, who will be spending more time on the back end of the process. So more around, once you understand what it is you're building, how do you design a user experience around it, and also, you know, elements of visual design and so on. So those are the 2 bits. We'll probably spend 10 minutes on the process, 10 minutes chatting and taking your questions around the process, move on to the next part of the process, and then we'll have more time at the end for more or general questions. So that's how it's going to work. I think we can just dig straight in, and I'm going to hand over to Claire and let you kick off.
Cool, thanks, Johnny, and hi, everyone. So I'm going to, as Johnny mentioned, I'm going to kind of talk through how you get to that product definition, and I'm going to talk through various processes and tools that I've used at BBC News over the last few years, and kind of the piece of work that you do after you've got your strategic proposition, so you understand where your market is and what it is that you're trying to achieve. This is the piece of work that gets you to understand what the product actually looks like and what it's doing for your users. Of course, we're saying no product is the same as another, no process is the same as another. So these are just a few useful things that I've used over the last few years. And yeah, we'll talk through them. So the three kind of main areas I'm going to talk about are user needs, outcomes and opportunities, and scope and constraints. And then, I think Michael's going to go into more detail about the actual kind of design part. Thanks, Kim. So from a user needs perspective, basically the reason that you want to gather user needs is to help you gain an accurate view of what your users actually want and need from your product, and what kinds of problems they have that you can solve for them. They're really useful for identifying opportunities. So depending on what it is you're trying to achieve, you'll need to kind of define opportunity, come across opportunities that are going to let you achieve that. And then also they're really useful for actually inspiring design work. So the kind of piece of work that comes a bit later on when you're really getting stuck into how the product actually works, user needs, a well-written user need is a really good prompt for a designer to get stuck into a solution of how to solve that problem, how to satisfy that need. So I think there are three, back to the last slide. Thanks, Kim. So I think there are three main ways to gather user needs. One is the proposition research. So that is what you may have received from your kind of strategic piece of work done up front. And you should be able to kind of pull out user needs from there. If you don't have any research like that, or maybe it's not rich enough from the user's perspective, you may need to do specific research around this. And I found the best way to kind of pull out these user needs is ethnographic research. So that's talking with people about their lives and understanding where they're coming from. And if you're doing it specifically about this product, it lets you really kind of dig in deep to what it is that they actually are looking for. And then you can also find user needs in user feedback and in kind of data analytics if you have existing products. So feedback can come from anywhere, direct communication from your users, if you've got apps, from the App Store reviews, that kind of stuff. So you can kind of identify common themes and needs, user needs from there. And then also from data analytics, if you have digital products already, maybe your content's on a website and you're thinking about building an app, for example. You can use the data that you're getting from that website to kind of infer user needs. Obviously, it's best if you can use both the kind of ethnographic stuff about, that you've got from talking to users, as well as data. One particular case that I used this pretty successfully was with the Learning English app, which is, so Learning English is part of the World Service. It's aimed at international audiences. And it had a website. We were thinking about making an app, a native app. And we noticed, or basically through kind of looking at the data of the website, it was really clear that the audience was mainly on desktop, which is a bit surprising actually, because the vast majority of our websites, the audience is mainly on mobile. But it was a pretty good audience on desktop. The pages per visit were pretty high, the frequency of visit was pretty high. So there's obviously something engaging about this content that people wanted to come back to, but something wrong with the mobile offer of this website. And there's also the kind of wider contextual view of learning, language learning on digital, that actually the vast majority of products that do language learning are apps, things like Duolingo and Memrise. So that kind of wider context, the market context, obviously influenced what users expect from language learning on mobile. So that set us up really nicely to kind of go ahead and build the Learning English app. Thanks, Kim. The next thing I'm going to talk about is outcomes and opportunities. So outcomes should describe what you're aiming for, where you're trying to get to, and opportunities are how you get there. So you've kind of got your user needs, you know what problem you're solving. This is how you're going to get there and what you're going to achieve. So outcomes are a way to frame your business needs, or maybe your client needs, depending on how you're working, as outcomes rather than requirements. So not jumping to solutions, not kind of getting stuck on one thing very early on and then kind of just delivering that. Outcomes really allow you to step back and think through what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I know from the kind of past webinars that that you've done on this, within this course, there's a lot about engagement, right? Engagement is a real precursor to getting people to subscribe to products. So presumably a lot of the outcomes that a lot of the people on this call will be thinking about are about how you really engage your audience and get them really into your content. So opportunities are then basically, there are various ways that you can achieve that outcome, whether it's a single or multiple outcome. And the opportunities you identify can come from those user needs that you pulled out earlier, or from just general market context that you understand because that's the business that you're in. And a way to kind of lay out a tool that I've used a few times now to lay out those outcomes, opportunities and solutions is called the opportunity solution tree, which you can see on your screen now. And this is a tool made by a woman called Teresa Torres. And there's a really good Mind the Product talk if you want to go and kind of find out more about this specifically. And basically what it does is it really helps you visualize the connection between the outcome you're aiming for, the opportunities you've identified, and then what you could actually build for users, the solutions that you could actually build. And it's really useful for transparency, for talking to your team about your thought process and where you are, you know, what you've pulled out from research and what that's telling you about your audience, and really also useful for talking to stakeholders and showing them the breadth of ideas that you've got and the range of opportunities that you've identified and are considering. And then of course getting lots of feedback from relevant parties on all of those things. It also really helps with pet ideas, which we all know is a problem that we have, and it really just very visually and very clearly shows that that's one idea in a set of many ideas, and in fact potentially the idea that pet idea is making the most of an opportunity that's actually not the biggest opportunity that you have at your fingertips. So that's the main opportunity tree on the left, and then on the right is a kind of variation on it that I've used particularly on one project for the World Service, which is around connecting up those user needs with opportunities. And this is really useful if you have a lot of different opportunities, or if you really need to focus in on one, because it really shows you that connection between the user needs and the opportunity, and then you can evaluate the value of that opportunity to you and to your audience, basically. So that's really useful. So yeah, as I said, I've used this for the World Service. We had pretty big goals about kind of reach, increasing audience numbers, that kind of stuff, and lots of ideas about how to achieve that. So this was really useful, a really useful tool in very clearly laying out where we were, all the ideas and all that kind of stuff, and then effectively evaluating them, in a kind of unbiased way. And an example, just kind of give you an example of the kinds of things we looked at. So we have 41 different language news websites. And obviously we make content in lots of different formats on those news websites: video, audio, text, data viz, that kind of stuff. And and there's often overlap between the usage of the languages. So we wanted to kind of really make the most of that opportunity of moving our existing users through those different types of content. So that was the opportunity we identified. It helped us kind of, achieve the outcome of increased reach through engagement. And the kinds of ideas that we had to make the most of the opportunity were a tool that would help you kind of see that there are other languages available. So content-led promo, a podcast promo, so having podcast content in lots of different places on the site. And then a discover more, so allowing users to kind of dig deeper into a particular topic, but in various formats. Cool, thanks Kim. Last slide. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is scope and constraints. So now you've got a picture of what your audience needs, what your users need from you, and how you're going to make them, kind of how you're going to solve that need for them. Then there's a kind of a bit of reality really with scope and constraints that you need to define. So defining your scope and then prioritizing the work within that scope is really important, because that is what's going to let you focus on the key stuff first, get that done, and make sure that you get that stuff done. And also thinking through scope is really a really useful tool for being realistic about what it is that you can deliver, like thinking through this stuff in kind of reality. On the screen, you can see the classic delivery triangle of scope, time and cost. And this, it always comes into play with projects. For us at the BBC, cost normally just means, the size of the team that you have, the people that you have to work on something, rather than the actual cost. But it's really useful because the way they interplay, it helps you understand where your flexibility is and where you're fixed on parts. So for example, if your timeline is fixed, so if your project has a hard deadline, like the Olympics, say, you can't move the Olympics. It's definitely not going to move, even if you haven't finished your shiny feature. Although they didn't move this year. So, and then your time is fixed. Your people are fixed because you have the team that you have to work on this project. So the thing that has to be flexible is the scope. So that shows you immediately that whatever you're planning to work on through that fixed time period with those fixed people has to be flexible. And that's really good to understand up front. And then constraints. So constraints are really useful for kind of understanding what's important and what's feasible. I think they can be really useful for when you're working with design teams on what it is that you're going to deliver and what they should focus on, what they should focus on with their work. At the BBC particularly, we've got very complex publishing pipelines for all kinds of different content. Obviously we kind of cover everything, video, audio, all kinds of things, and all the way from broadcast, traditional broadcast, to digital. And so those systems provide complexity and also constraints on that content that comes out the other end. So often we have to kind of think through how we're going to handle that before we get going with the project. And that's the key. I think understanding your constraints up front means you're not going to have any kind of nasty surprises later. And you can actually use them to focus on the most important pieces of work. And I think a nice kind of example of where using scope and constraints to help a project move along faster was recently, in the last year or so, we rebuilt all of the front pages of all of those language news websites. And we decided that the initial scope for what we wanted to get out the door was just a mobile only design. So the vast majority of our audience was mobile. So we kind of took that piece of data to convince our stakeholders it was okay to put a product live that was basically not really designed for desktop. And that meant that we could save time on design, save time on development up front, and get something in front of the audience much quicker. So those things can really be used for kind of the benefit of you and for your product development. So, that's me.
So lots of questions that are popping up in my mind. I'd love to ask you back to the first slide or one of the early slides, and you were talking about the user research being one of the inputs to the process for you. How do you, because, okay, you're asking, I'm guessing, amongst other things, you're asking people what they want. And I'm assuming you get a lot back. Do you have kind of tips and tricks to be able to filter the feedback you're getting, which, and it's hard to know, right, which genuinely is going to become, a useful feature for the product versus something that lots of people are asking for, but might not actually be useful for the product? Do you have a way of dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways you can never really know, because people ask for things that they don't actually need and they don't realize that they need, that kind of thing. So I don't think it's a foolproof process, but definitely talking to real users. I mean, particularly when we work with international users, they're, depending on where they are in the world, they have a very different experience of the internet from us. And so that's really key for kind of understanding, their experience. I think a kind of good combination is if you do kind of an interview style piece of research, so you pull out hopefully relatively organically what those needs are. So you kind of start with pretty broad questions, and obviously don't kind of lead your user down a particular path. And then if you do that, with enough users, you find themes, and then those themes you can kind of test them with a larger group of people through something like a survey. So then you can kind of back up that more qualitative research with some quantitative data that you get through doing that survey. And I think the combination of those probably gives you kind of the best chance for finding, what those things really are. But yeah, it is tricky. Asking users what they want is not the ideal.
Yeah.
You can definitely ask them about their experience, their life experience. You're not really digging into, do you want this button in this position or that color or that kind of stuff. You're kind of understanding how their lives work and that kind of stuff.
And I mean, you obviously, as a company, have untold resources and money. So for smaller companies, I mean, even one like ours, right? But for lots of publishers who probably don't have huge budgets for research, I mean, is there a way of doing this at a slightly lower cost? If you can't afford to spend a lot of money on this?
That is a good question. You're right. I do take for granted that we have a research team at our disposal. I mean, I suppose if you can't afford to do research, then the other bits come into play. That stuff about, listening to feedback from your users in other situations. If you have existing products with them, obviously, if it's a brand new product, then it does get much trickier. I think then you're kind of looking at more kind of competitor research and that kind of stuff in the market in general.
How are you going about the election thing? That sounds really interesting.
For the US election?
Yeah.
Well, it is very interesting. What's particularly tricky about the US election for the BBC, from my point of view, is that we have essentially three different audiences. So we have the UK audience, which is obviously our kind of primary audience, and their perspective, our perspective on the US election is kind of as an outsider, but pretty important to us. It does make an impact on our lives, but we're not part of it. And then we have our US audience, which is pretty sizable, who are obviously the voters. And so they're going to have a different perspective. And then we have our international, outside of UK, outside of US audience, who are equally, as interested, similarly from the UK perspective. And so where we've got to with the US section actually is kind of being pretty clear that our position, our kind of role, is not so much about providing the detailed results, like the really kind of granular level, county level detail results, because that's done. It's mainly interesting to US audiences, and it's done pretty heavily by US media companies. But our role is actually, providing the results. And also, what's that kind of British UK perspective on this? That's what people kind of tend to come to us for. But yeah, it's very interesting.
Yeah, I can imagine. When are we going to be able to see it?
Well, the bit that I work on, you'll see on the night because it's the actual results.
Oh gosh. Okay. Wow. Very cool. But I had a question that came in from Robert Kinsler. Funnily enough, I think the question Robert was asking was exactly the question I asked, which was totally independent around smaller companies. But Robert, if I asked the wrong question, do let me know. I think it's probably time to have Michael come in now. So Michael is actually going to talk a little bit about how Tortoise do the similar sort of stuff to you, but then also touching on user experience and visual design. So thanks for that, Claire. We're going to definitely come back to you, so don't go anywhere. And please, in the room, please do keep sending us your questions, and I'll be fielding them to Claire and Michael. But Michael, yes, let's hand over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. So yeah, I guess what we're trying to look at here is, how do we get to good and engaging design for our products? And I think one way to approach that question is to think about, what is bad design? And that's really simple. Bad design is design that doesn't work. A lot of the worst design I've been has been really beautiful, but just has, not done the job that needs to be done. That's not about having bad designers. That's about designing the wrong thing. My job title at Tortoise is head of product. I sometimes think it should be head of triage. I seem to spend so much of my time telling people they can't have things or what we're not going to do. Certainly unlike the BBC, we're a startup. We've got a lot of constraints on ourselves. And I think in product design, you're always I've got my own delivery triangle here, Claire, slightly different from yours. Trying to triangulate these three things and find the sweet spot between the kind of business needs, the customer needs, and the technology constraints. Actually, not just constraints, but opportunities. I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of tech startups have moved towards cross-disciplinary teams, is because it is good to look at the platforms and available technologies you've got and listen to your developers very early on in the process. You might discover opportunities that are waiting to be capitalized that you could do relatively cheaply or quickly that you wouldn't necessarily know about if you just went through a kind of funnel from business needs all the way through. So, what is the right thing to do? We're trying to now winnow all this stuff down to what is the right thing to do. And I think that to some extent depends on the maturity of the product, the market, and the business. This is kind of an adoption curve. I love to be at the far left here. I love the new product and the new business with the new market. It's a very exciting space if you're a product designer, because by definition, those people who will use a new product are the kind of people who will use new products. They're innovators, they're early adopters, they're usually a little bit tech savvy, they're willing to accommodate change, they're quite forgiving often, reasonably price insensitive as well. It's a kind of nice space to work in. If you're early in the stage of the business as well, you're quite likely got a small team who are forced to be sort of cross-disciplinary because you're just not big enough to spin off departments for every little thing. So you talk to each other more, and I think that's also really valuable. When you get to the other end of the curve, often it's a lot more about optimization. It's a lot more about, do we make the button bigger or bluer or whatever, and will we get better conversion? You focus on tweaking acquisition metrics and so on. When you're in a startup, it's much more about discovering what the product and the market are, and premature optimization is completely your enemy, and as a thing you have to really fight hard against. There's a lot of sort of sunk cost fallacy in this. It's very easy to build something and then look at the metrics and they're not quite, and tweak them, when actually you should probably just kind of kill it and move on and do something else instead. So, I suppose, the question we look at here then is, what are the key metrics? What are the habits that we're trying to build for the users of our product? And that's how we try and winnow down the features that we're trying to do. You could say with Tortoise, we made things quite hard for ourselves. We set out to do a sort of slow news business. And you can see that a lot of the sort of tool set that you would normally use in the media business is quite hard to apply. What kind of sampling strategy can you have when you only publish one big story a week? Where does the paywall live? There, it's quite hard. What habits can you make? How can you make a daily habit with something that is at that sort of cadence? Well, the answer to that, I think, is to step back a little bit and look at the breadth of our proposition and look at our whole product in the round. Our product is not just our app. Our product is not journalism. Just journalism. Journalism is not even the core of our product. The core of our product is these think-ins that we do, which are discussion events where we get our membership together with experts on a particular topic, and we kick around an idea on either pre-COVID in the room or online, and find what journalistic threads we can pick up from that and run that forward into stories. So if you think about user needs, as in this diagram, there are a bunch of user needs that any news business fulfills. But as a membership business, which we are, there are additional set of needs that we can try and address. And because we've got this kind of purpose and mission at the heart of what we're doing, there's another layer beyond that. And you can imagine we can try and both design and build features that connect with various of these needs in different ways, but also try and we will see some kind of movement of members up from just consuming our content, perhaps to the most committed of them, buying into the mission and becoming ambassadors for what we're doing. So, okay, how do we actually do it then? The thing is, there's no time here really to delve into different kinds of, UX techniques and details and so on. So many methodologies and tools and what have you are kind of kicking around. And I think a lot of this stuff, a key thing is fitting it to the culture of your team. There is no, say design sprints are a very popular technique in some types of businesses, and others will completely fall flat and you just won't be able to make it fit to the culture, so that's a waste of everybody's time. But I think at the heart of nearly all of it, the really core technique is iteration. In a way, that's as true in a mature product as it is in an early stage one. In a mature product, that iteration is going to be all about optimization and so on. And an early stage product is going to be radical iteration. Now, we have done a lot of iteration in Tortoise. We've iterated like mad. We've changed our publishing schedule from 5 stories a day, 6 days a week, down to your one big story split into parts over the week. We've changed the time of day that we've published stuff. We've introduced audio. We've experimented with story formats, changed the navigation, all kinds of things. And because we're in that early stage and our audience are those sort of early adopters, they love that. They don't mind. We get very little pushback on doing change. So when we're trying to settle on a new feature or user need that we're trying to meet, the idea is to kind of go through this iteration loop as quickly as you can, and that might start with increasing levels of fidelity and potentially killing it somewhere along the line there. Very often starting with pencil and paper or whiteboard or something like this. But I think it's important to go interactive as soon as you possibly can, as early in the process as you can. You can't really get the kind of the feel of the product until you feel it, moving under your fingers and responding to user input and so on. I've never seen a piece of static design handed over and implemented and we went, yeah, that was it. That's just not a thing that happens. So, and that can be tools as simple as Keynote or PowerPoint in the early stages, frankly. There are lots of other kind of dedicated tools that are kicking around for this kind of thing. I also like to move to building HTML-based prototypes as soon as possible, something that's built with kind of real code, and that you can get an even better idea of how it works before you kind of go into beta. So some of this is actually about the framework choices you make when you're when you're setting up, and that might not sound like a design issue, but it really is. Have you got a kind of set of a framework or a set of patterns that you can iterate quickly on top of? I think that's a kind of really key thing. Okay, yes. So one thing we want to do, of course, as well, is differentiate. I think when you're a new media business going into a reasonably crowded marketplace, we are trying to do things different. We have to establish what that difference is. One of the things we realized was that one thing that looks like a sort of in one light a weakness, this slow cadence, is actually also a strength. And it led us down a route of doing very crafted design, that we're trying to avoid anything that looks algorithmic, because frankly, we can afford to. We have the time to do bespoke bits, fit design to individual stories as we publish them. Actually, current round of design work we're doing at the moment is going to break down some elements of our app that look, too algorithmic at the moment, and bring more craft to them. That's possibly enough for me to be kicking off with. I don't know if anyone's got any questions they want to ask about any of this.
I certainly have a question while we wait to see if people in the room do. And this is something that all three of us have had conversations about in the past, which is the element of delight. And how do you, with two questions actually, and I'd love to hear from both of you. How do you introduce delight into a product? But more importantly, how does delight sit along other features with respect to the budget you give it and the time you allocate to it? Because it's one of these things that it's extremely important, and yet when you put it up against other things, it very quickly gets pushed away. So whoever wants to start, I'd love to hear. Maybe Claire, why don't you kick us off on that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's exactly right that often the delight gets pushed further and further down the priority list because there are things that are considered more important. I think in an election context, often the delight is, or you could consider the kind of animations of data visualizations to be the delight. But I think you can use that if you do it in the right way. You can use that animation to also kind of help tell the story. Mm-hmm. So if you can hit two things at the same time, delight and also education or explanation or whatever that thing is, then that gives it more weight, and it makes it much easier to prioritize against other pieces of work. I think if it feels just there for the sake of it, then it is very difficult to get it on the list. Yeah.
And Michael?
Yeah, I'd say for us, the delight is mostly in that way that we're crafting design around stories, often with heavy elements of data visualization and infographics and so on embedded in the story. And in terms of the kind of app UX, that we're trying to be as unobtrusive as we can. Little moments of delight are nice, but they're kind of not essential. It's mostly about keeping that stuff light and functional as a scaffold for holding this kind of rich, crafted, and hopefully delightful content.
And when but when we talk about delight in content and storytelling, and I think we've all seen examples over the last couple of decades of the ability to introduce delight into storytelling, then being taken to the nth degree and actually destroying the storytelling. It becomes so complicated. And so, I'm thinking about kind of early iPad digital editions, maybe with popular mechanics and things flying in from every angle and all these builds, and a huge amount of parallax use over the last, few years. How do you temper that? How do you temper the desire for throwing the design kitchen sink at storytelling and it becoming just too much?
I love a bit of parallax myself, I've got to say. Because it can give a certain amount of kind of fluidity and responsiveness to the content, a little bit of life to it, but it's a matter of not overdoing these things. It is hard, especially a lot of the techniques we've seen, you look at it on a desktop and you think, wow, that's really lovely. And you look at it on mobile and it's just a terrible, terrible experience. You know, it's quite hard to deliver this sort of experience very well on mobile.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I suppose we have kind of fixed formats that allow you to do that kind of more kind of visual and experiential storytelling, and so they're not built as one-offs. So I think actually you have the inherent constraints of the tool that you're using to build that stuff, and I guess because of the way that, you know, that kind of thing works, to extend that tool is actually a much bigger piece of work, you know, than doing a kind of one-off fancy kind of thing. So I'm not sure that doing too much exciting stuff is a problem that we have actually at BBC News.
Yeah, well, you're lucky maybe.
Well, Johnny, I got to say, I love that stuff. I love working on those projects. When we land something a bit more like that, we don't see a big bump in the mailbag, you know, with people saying, I really love that stuff or whatever. You know, the stories that cut through and the stories that get people really excited are the ones that have impact in the world. You know, they're the ones where the Master of Trinity Hall has to stand down because of the scandal we exposed about him. You know, those are the stories that we get cut through on.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and actually, oh, sorry.
No, go.
Well, I was going to say that the example that I talked about where we built only the mobile design and the kind of desktop version was just a kind of stretched mobile for a while. We also didn't see any, you know, it's a very basic example. It's not kind of the delight end of storytelling, but we didn't see any change in user behavior or any kind of significant change in numbers. So I think there is a limit to how much those experience things actually affect users.
And do you, at the BBC, is it just a given now that it's mobile first and that's the starting point and desktop second, or does it is it? Yeah. Yeah, interesting.
Not for us, I got to say. I mean, we have much more of a split than that. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because we launched the product as pretty much mobile only, and then and certainly the storytelling is focused on a vertical screen. So how do you see that changing?
Yeah, no, I think we will move towards, page design that also works, you know, that isn't so mobile first on desktop. They're very different experiences after all. It's very, very hard to, I think when we started, you know, the whole idea of responsive design was you design once and it would kind of flex to fill any screen size. And actually it's more complicated than that, is the reality. You know, it's a much more intimate medium, mobile. And there's a kind of compressed way of relating a story there that doesn't necessarily translate so well to desktop. Right.
Well, we've got a question come in from Kelly Byrne, and funnily enough, it's an interesting question which might not affect either of you, given the nature of the question. But I think you probably will have an interesting perspective on it, which is, and I'm going to read it verbatim actually, in a constant battle with the sales team over monetizing every available ad space, so the commercial team, versus protecting user experience, do you have any advice on how to strike a balance between the two?
So we do have ads outside the UK. If you've ever browsed the BBC News website when you're allowed to be in a foreign country, you may have seen them. I mean, I feel like it's an ongoing balance, as you say. I think it's probably less about that one particular case and that kind of, you know, one example of putting this ad in that page, and more about the wider relationship between the commercial side and the editorial side in that business, in your business. So I think it's a bit hard to say. I think one trick which may work, depending on where you're looking, where your market is the weight of the page, the actual performance of the page, because we know that ads are very heavy, and that they do make a kind of slower experience for users. And so depending on, I mean, that's maybe more significant in international markets, but it might be something that you can use to kind of leverage, you know, the quicker your page loads, the more page views you will get. And actually, ultimately, maybe the more ad views you'll get, even though there are fewer ads. So.
Yes, interesting. And actually, so there's a build on that question, which I think is for you, Michael. So if you accept that maybe advertising isn't the only, or maybe even the best way to generate revenue from your content, what are the other sorts of models? I think it would be interesting if you could spend a couple of minutes on the tortoise model, actually.
Sure. I mean, we don't carry advertising. I mean, we do have a little bit of those sorts of struggles around, you know, how acquisition messaging gets inserted into pages and so on. Sadly, the data shows that all this really intrusive stuff works. You know, there you go. Our model is membership. Well, membership and partnership. There are two legs to it, really. The membership is about members buying into our mission and, you know, wanting to support our purpose and getting rewards for it as well. And, you know, there's a kind of reasonably low cost annual membership there. And the partnership bit is about, you know, businesses, non-profits, corporates, who also want to support our business, support our mission for one reason or another. And so we do carry, you know, sponsor logos and so on in certain places and things like that. You know, this is a good model.
Yeah, it seems to work. That was from Seema. Thanks, Seema. Another question that Jazz raised, well, actually was something I was thinking about as well, is the balance between acquisition and retention. So do you design differently for acquiring audience versus retaining your existing audience? Who wants that one?
I can go.
Yeah, go.
You take it up.
Yeah, really interesting question. So I think you do design differently, yes, between the two. And I think that, I mean, you know, with the stuff that we were talking about earlier, that's kind of takes you back to your outcomes of what you're actually trying to achieve. Is it acquisition or retention? And if so, you know, depending on that, then, you know, you kind of need to focus on different kinds of things. I think for acquisition, it's often actually kind of less about the actual design and more about how you get people to that content. So it could be, again, about performance. You know, the lighter your pages are, the higher up in Google you get, we think. And the more platforms you're on, potentially, you know, the more users that you're going to find. And then the kind of retention part, I think, is about the experience on your platform, on your site, once the user is there. And that's when you can kind of get really stuck into kind of designing for engagement and, you know, the kind of connection between engagement and the kind of frequency of visit and pages per visit. You know, if you can get users to view more content in a session, then they're more likely to return for another session at another time. So for that stuff, that's quite kind of, you know, that's quite kind of visceral. You could take that and design for that to kind of increase that particular behavior.
Mm-hmm. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah. For us, I think where we are right now, obviously, acquisition is important. Retention is beginning to become important. Engagement is a thing we most have to kind of focus on. Actually, that can be tricky, you know. I mean, obviously, we've hired people from larger news organizations who possibly it's the first time they've worked in a startup and who, you know, have come from worlds where they're maybe focused on narrow bits of acquisition optimization or churn reduction or any of these kinds of things. And that's, I think, a slightly different mindset in building a new type of product and about trying to discover exactly what that product is and what it is about it that will make people really engage with it.
No, you're good. Sorry, I thought I'd lost you there for a second, but I think you're still there. No, I think, okay, and something that just sprung to mind as you were both talking about that, on the acquisition side, is the use of Instagram. And at least in my experience, the BBC and Tortoise and The Economist, I have to say, and The New Yorker do an amazing job of getting content, onto that channel and really making it quite alluring on a channel that, at first instance, you wouldn't think that would be a good fit, and yet Instagram is becoming more and more important. I'd love to hear what you think about both the BBC and the Tortoise approach to design as it pertains to platforms like Instagram for acquisition. Go on, Claire.
Okay. Trying to be polite. Yeah, I think. I agree. I think kind of media organizations have found their footing on social platforms like Instagram, and it is very specific design. Really, yep. It is kind of visually, put together for that platform, like it's either main Instagram or Instagram TV, and it's also cut for that. Like for the majority of the video pieces that's what the BBC offer on Instagram, they're cut to a much shorter length than you would find those pieces on our own website, which is a nod to how people consume content on that platform. So I think it's about adapting what you do and maintaining your core values. It's still BBC journalism with the same values as you'd find on the BBC website, but it's adapted for that platform.
And how is it performing compared to Twitter now? Is it catching up, overtaken already, miles behind?
I don't think it's. I think it's behind for us. I must have been. I haven't looked at the stats really recently, so I kind of can't answer that one. Our membership skew is really young, for a media organization, very young. So we are super interested in Instagram as a channel. Weirdly, LinkedIn works quite well too. So yeah, it's a mix.
Well, how do you tackle LinkedIn from a design standpoint then?
Yeah, it's not really about design, is it?
Well, I don't know. I assume there has to be some visual elements to how you take over as much of the feed as possible.
No, I'm not really on top of that. Sorry, Johnny. Can't help you.
TikTok, maybe. If you're looking for the under audience. Okay, let me just see. Are there any other? I'm going to just check, see if there are any other questions coming from the audience.
I had a question for Michael in the meantime.
Yes, please.
In your kind of iteration cycle, and actually a few times you mentioned, killing features either presumably after they've gone live or before they've even gone live. Yeah. I think that can be really hard to do, particularly if you've kind of sold that feature to to kind of get some initial investment in the first place with your stakeholders. I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that kind of how you actually go about killing features and kind of not losing people's faith.
Yeah, I think it is really hard. We are super transparent across the business about what the data is telling us and our current numbers, and we have a whole team review every week of all our metrics and so on. It is a newsroom as well, nobody's an atheist in a newsroom. We know there's a God and his name is editor, so there is a ability to chop things or bring things to life quite quickly if it needs to be done. But yeah, of course, people have invested time and energy and so on in doing things, and it is always a bit hard to kill your darlings. There's no question about that.
I've got one parting question for both of you, actually, and it's around audio. I know that particularly for Tortoise, audio is becoming more and more important, and I'm assuming, well, for the BBC, it's always been important from year dot. But is audio, is that changing the way you look at design, or at least changing the way you look at the product?
For us, it's something we're really focused on right now. We almost accidentally drifted into doing a podcast halfway through last year. It went really well. We discovered we're quite good at it. we're now looking at, you know, how we can expand that, what we can do differently, what we can do that's new in the audio space. So yeah, definitely a thing we're thinking about for sure. I don't know I can share too much detail on.
We'll wait to see exactly what that looks like then. And Claire, any parting shots from you? Because I'm going to have to wrap up. I can't believe we've almost run out of time.
Yeah, I mean, I think audio, you know, accessing audio on digital is a really interesting kind of problem, really. Like podcasts, particularly podcast discovery, is definitely a really interesting area. You know, there's obviously a bit of a battle going on for the market, essentially, for the podcast market. You know, do you go to a platform that is all open and, you know, what podcasts were originally kind of intended to be, or, you know, definitely podcast platforms have now started doing exclusive content, which definitely changes the kind of that world. I mean, personally, I've not really done anything on audio myself, but it's definitely that challenge of, if you're creating audio, how do you, you know, promote it enough on your own sites and make it, you know, available enough on your own platform, but also understand that actually probably the majority of the consumption is not going to be on your platform. Yep. Which I think isn't very natural for the BBC. Actually, we kind of expect people to be on our own platforms most of the time.
Yes, and a problem, or a question that Michael and the Tortoise team are grappling with as well right now. But unfortunately, I can't believe it, but we've got 2 minutes left to go, so I'm going to have to wrap up. I'm just going to quickly kind of wrap up a couple of points that at least I, heard us covering. So Claire was talking about product definition, working out what you're going to build and why, understanding and gathering user needs, looking at opportunities and outcomes in order to work out how to prioritize the features and capabilities that you're going to build into the product, but also understanding how is your scope constrained and what's flexible. Designing for mobile versus desktop versus audio, but also, you know, how do you balance the needs of the business and of your reader or consumer and of technology and how that constrains it. Iterative design. So Michael spent a good amount of time talking about iteration and the value of prototyping in various different forms, and loads of other stuff. I feel like we could have spoken for at least another half hour. It was really good of you. Thanks to Claire and Michael for giving us your time. Hopefully, there were a couple of questions we didn't quite answer, but I will put up on the website how you can find Claire and Michael, at least through the official channels, through Twitter and so on. And if you want to be put in touch with them, we'll make sure that we do that. As I said, this has been recorded, so you'll be able to watch this again if needs be, or share with your friends and colleagues. And the last thing to say is this is, as I said at the outset, this is part of a series. This was just the third class in a series of 10. So do please come back and watch and hear the other ones. So next week we've got Piano talking about customer messaging strategy, and the week after, the Manifesto team are going to be talking about engagement thinking in the organization, both of which are going to have some really good guests again. So do check back. And if you're interested in just understanding more about the whole thing, if you go to the Building a Subscription Business website, you'll get all of the info. So thanks again to Michael and Claire. Thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Thank you.